Yeah, our next presenter is joining us online from the Ohio State University. We are so pleased to have Dr. Robyn Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the Professor of Risk Analysis and Decision Science in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at the Ohio State University. Since beginning her academic career at Ohio State in 2007, her work has focused primarily on the interplay between intuitive and analytic information processing and the influence this has on risk perception and ultimately judgment or choice behavior. She is also interested in the development of risk communication and decision support tools to inform decision making and risk management. Her current research focus is on adaptation to climate-exacerbated hazards such as wildfire and eutrophication, and what motivates and constrains different land use and land management decisions on private and public lands. She served as the chair of the Planning Committee on Integrating the Human Sciences to Scale Societal Responses to Environmental Change, a workshop convened by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Wilson.
Great, thank you, Carmen. I hope you are all hearing me okay. We tested things earlier, so great. And we're seeing the title slide. Excellent. Well, thanks again for having me, and thanks everyone for attending and allowing me to participate remotely. When Carmen reached out and shared that she had participated in the workshop she referenced and was hoping that I could come and just kind of cover some of the highlights from that work and just kind of broadly also talk about the importance of broadening the way we think about science to inform climate action and bringing in the workshop focused on human sciences. I focused my title here on social and behavioral sciences because that's more of my sweet spot. But I'll certainly give some broader nods to the human science enterprise as we go. So just a little bit of background. If you're interested, you can go onto the National Academy's website and obviously see more details about this report and this work. But generally, what we were asked to do with this workshop was to answer 3 questions. How do we integrate, align, and converge the broad mix of human sciences to inform and enhance human responses to environmental change? We very quickly spent some time thinking about defining what we mean by human science. Excuse me, I have a little tickle starting. In responses to environmental change, our focus really was on climate action. How do we enable a resilient civic body to be prepared to respond to environmental shifts, uncertainties, and damages? And how do we understand and promote the action that is needed in a way that is equitable and inclusive? So we were given that task. We spent a lot of time with a great workshop committee kind of thinking through this rather big task. And what I'll share with you today are some of the highlights that came out of the work, out of that 2-day workshop, and that you can find also summarized in this report. So my plan is to talk a little bit about what I mean by human science, a little bit about why the human sciences are so important to these questions, a little more about what we mean by climate action. And while this would be an entire, semester's worth of a course to talk about what we know works well to engage and mobilize, again, I'll try to highlight some of the things that we know and point you to some of the resources and even just create awareness, I think, that those resources are out there. And then how do we move forward? So Carmen said one of the kind of learning goals for this particular piece of the webinar today was to get people kind of aware of how to broaden the way we might think about the work we do and the people we should be engaging with or partnering with, but also knowing how to really move forward and to take action and do things differently. So I'll try to do a bit of that as well. So what are the human sciences? If you Google that, you'll find an array of definitions ranging from the behavioral sciences to the social sciences to the moral sciences, political, economic. You'll see some definitions that are more inclusive in bringing in the humanities and thinking about even, I guess, areas we wouldn't typically think of as science per se, but different ways of knowing and different important lenses to these challenges. Another way to think about them are just the human actions and interactions, and trying to understand that, and to understand that in the context of environmental change is particularly important. Understanding connections among biological, social, and cultural phenomena to address the major issues and problems that we're facing in a rapidly changing world. So as a behavioral scientist myself, you probably gleaned from the introduction, a lot of the work that I do is as a behavioral scientist, but on interdisciplinary teams, working with engineers, with physical scientists, with folks in medicine and public health, in ecology and biology, to try to integrate and to think more, integratively, to think more comprehensively about the research questions that we're interested in, to think about these feedbacks and dynamics between social systems and human systems, and those kind of natural systems that we tend to focus much more on when trying to understand these challenges. And it might be, some of you have probably thought about this before, some of you maybe haven't, but why the human sciences? It might seem kind of obvious at first glance, but I have a few things, some food for thought to think about why this is so particularly important. This is a paper that I often have my students read in my introduction to psychology and environmental problems course that I teach to undergraduates, but it's by Wes Schultz, a Californian. It's a great paper talking about the importance of behavior and conservation. And he basically says, the causes of our deteriorating environmental conditions are humans, and specifically human behavior. Certainly, environmental degradation happens from natural processes as well, but mostly it's the result of human activity. And accordingly, efforts to promote conservation must change behavior. And we can think about behavior very narrowly, individual choices, consumer behavior, homeowner decisions. We can also think of it broadly, institutional behavior, and how our polities organize and interact. So, he's a psychologist and thinks about it in that sort of lens, but again, I think we can think about it more broadly than that as well. Another why the human sciences, I find this particularly interesting as a social scientist who works in this space and is fairly well funded in this space, but this is an overview of funding for climate research across the natural and technical sciences up on the top there versus the social sciences and humanities. And you can see while there was a big uptick in the kind of early to mid 2000s in our funding for climate research, the majority of that funding is still going to those natural and technical sciences. Right? Very little of that funding is going to the social sciences. Yet, according to Wes Schultz and to a lot of folks who work in this space, we're the problem and we're the solution. So why are we not investing more in understanding those dynamics? Why are we not more thoughtful and integrative in bringing this perspective into the way we think about these problems? Here's another sort of visual, I think, that starts to give you that idea. So this is from a paper in Environmental Science and Policy, but talking about reference systems for global change research. And that we can't really understand these global changes. We can't understand the causes and the drivers. We can't understand the likely solutions without a really holistic picture of not just engineering and natural science, which is, again, where a lot of our first thoughts go, of kind of just understanding the system with humans considered kind of separate from it, or just thinking about technological solutions to these challenges. But yet the humanities, the social sciences, the economic sciences are really critical to understand how we cope with change, how we perceive change, and those feedbacks between, again, the human system and the natural system are just very, very critical. So what do we mean by action? So the focus of that workshop and the work that we did was kind of, environmental change broadly, but when it came down to it, we're talking about climate action, right? There's lots of environmental changes, but a lot of those environmental changes, if not directly climate driven or indirectly climate driven, and so we really mean climate action, but what do we mean by climate action? And for a long time, the focus in climate action has really been on mitigation. So this kind of left side of the diagram, so actions to reduce emissions that cause climate change, right? Buy more energy efficient vehicles, invest in clean energy, use energy more efficiently within your homes, programmable thermostats, right? All of these things. But recently we've started to talk more about adaptation as well. And for a long time, there was a concern that we couldn't talk about adaptation because it would give people a false sense of security that while we can just adapt to these hazards that we're experiencing into these challenges, and maybe we don't have to mitigate. So I think there was hesitancy to talk about adaptation due to fear that it might demotivate actions around mitigation. But the research has largely shown that that's not the case, that these two can coexist in human minds, but also importantly, that they have to coexist. It's too late to not do both, right? We focused on mitigation for a long time, and now we realize like we're experiencing these impacts, and while over the long term through mitigation, we could perhaps slow down or start to reverse the trends that we're seeing, in the short term, we have to adapt. We have to find ways to deal with these changes. But resilience is kind of the intersection of the two, right? These are the things that we can be doing that would both reduce emissions that cause climate change, but also manage the risks of those climate exacerbated impacts that we're experiencing. And so I think a classic example to think about, especially in urban areas, is planting trees, right? So no trees sequester carbon. That's one way to start to remove some of the carbon from the atmosphere that's contributing to our challenges. But also trees in urban areas provide shade and can have significant positive impacts during heat waves due to heat island effects in urban areas. And so that's one of these win-win solutions. So resilience, again, this is really what we're talking about, is how do we promote resilience? And how do we do those things in a just way that also improves power balances or existing imbalances to be more balanced? How do we bounce back better from these sorts of events? And so it's not just coping, it's not just surviving, right? But it's changing our systems in ways that are really significant, not just essentially or eventually for the climate system, but also for our human systems as well. And I think this is like my last graphic, kind of thinking about what we mean by climate action. But I think, again, it's a good visual for what we're really trying to achieve. This is from Environmental Science and Policy. But you've got a little chart here that's showing you on the x-axis, right, as we're moving to the right, the magnitude of the climate change response, how big these changes might be that we're asking of society. And here on the y-axis, the magnitude of the human inputs, what's it going to take for us to do that? And down here we have inaction, where we're suffering, where we're not seeing progress, right? It's almost no response, but it's not taking a lot of effort from us. Next, we might move into coping sorts of behaviors, and their examples here are from agriculture, but you could insert any sort of sector, climate impacted sector. Coping might be we do some really small things that perhaps minimize these impacts a little bit, have some sort of net positive benefit, but don't require too much effort on our part. Then we move up into true adaptation. True adaptation, but maybe incremental adaptation, right? So a little more effort, a little more return. But what we're really shooting for and what we really need to do is this transformative adaptation. And this is perhaps where true resilience lives. This might be recognizing there's places we can't live. This might be recognizing there are different ways to use the land resources that we have available to us. And this is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of people. It's going to involve a lot of partnerships across various sectors and organizations. It's going to require us to move away from the status quo in the way that our societies are currently structured. It's going to have some uncertainty and some risk, right? So these are the higher risk, higher reward sorts of actions. And it's going to require us to really change some of our assumptions and our values and really start to think differently. So this is a very heavy lift, but this is really what we're shooting for. These are the sorts of things. And again, these sorts of challenges, I think, even call for the human sciences more because we're asking so much of people in this solution space. So I want to talk a little bit about what works well to engage and mobilize. And like I said, this would be, an entire course or several courses. This would be a whole degree program for someone who's really interested in this. But I will try to distill some of this down to some of the things that we focused on the most in the workshop, and again, point you to some other resources if you're interested. So one thing we know is we need to focus on those most at risk, right? It can be overwhelming to think about solving all these problems across all of space and time and across all demographics and communities. But what we need to do in the near term is really focus in on those people most heavily impacted. When we talk about heat waves, it might be the elderly in urban areas, right, that experience the greatest probability of death during those events. It might be disadvantaged communities in low-lying coastal areas that don't have the resources to move or to make some of the choices that others might be making to avoid the risk, right? So we really need to start to think about funneling our energy and our resilience efforts, right, into these very targeted ways. We need to focus on the community scale and collective action. This requires individual buy-in and structural support, but the action is happening at the community level, right? So even think about like global agreements to address climate change. It's not global action, right? It's a global agreement that we're all going to go back and figure out what we can do locally, right? So cities have climate plans, countries have climate plans, states have climate plans, because that's really where the action has to happen, is at that community level. So we have to get the individuals in those communities to buy into what we're doing, and we need that structural or kind of top-down support, supportive federal policies. But the action has to be at that community scale, and it has to be a kind of we're in this together, all right? Because we're talking about problems that don't have boundaries. And so we really all have to work together, even though the way that we're impacted might vary. And I feel like I can't talk about that without nodding to Eleanor Ostrom and her work. Again, I hope some people in the room are familiar with this, but she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2009. She's a political economist. And she really demonstrated that these common pool resource challenges, of which we can think about climate change that way and a lot of environmental change that way, can actually be effectively managed collectively without government or private control, right? Without top-down regulation, without privatizing a resource. If you get groups of people at the community scale who know each other and trust each other, and they set their own rules of engagement, they can solve these problems. And so we need to be doing that, right? We need millions of little communities everywhere working together to solve the problems locally. And we know it can work. There's evidence it can work, and we need more of that. We also can supersize what local coalitions are doing through the human sciences. And so often if you look across the landscape of whether it's California or the West or the United States or the globe, there are a lot of success stories, right? There are local examples of people working together to make real progress. We don't want those successes to be isolated. And so the human sciences can come in and help us understand, why did that work? What was it in that situation that made it work, and how can we replicate that? How can we share those lessons learned with other communities who want to do the same thing, again, in their own local context? We need to invest in people on the ground. The knowledge and the leaders are there. Communities don't necessarily need saved by us, whether the us is the academic institution, the government, or somebody else, right? We have the people out there, and we need to invest in those people that are out there. I thought this was kind of a cool resource that people may or may not be familiar with, but the National League of Cities has a great website where they highlight some of these really cool partnerships and things that are happening around climate action. So really thinking about the action happening at this municipal level, and how municipalities, the local governmental sector, is working with local organizations for equitable and effective climate action. And they have cool examples here in New Orleans and Raleigh, North Carolina, Boston, Massachusetts. But they're out there, right? And there's good examples of it. We can, again, in the human sciences, help maybe scale that up, or help people learn from that local success in ways that are scalable. And if you haven't done this sort of work, partnering, engaging, working together towards understanding and solutions, again, lots of best practice out there for this. No need to reinvent the wheel, no need to figure it out as you go. This is a paper that was published by the organizing committee of a National Academy of Medicine recent report talking about what meaningful community engagement is. And this has a focus on health equity and transforming systems for health. But again, a great resource that helps you just kind of think through, again, what do we know from the human sciences about how to do this well? How do we actually do this? So don't feel like you're on your own and you're doing it for the first time. The resources are out there. Our workshop and our committee and the speakers we invited in did talk a bit about building those community partnerships. So while I'm, again, not going to cover all of the best practice in this space, some of the things that our panelists and our guest speakers at the workshop really focused on from the community perspective. So if you're someone in a community and some partner organization is coming in, a hospital, a municipality, a university, right? Insert any of these kind of institutions. What are the things that we could be doing better as that outside entity? We need to meet communities where they are. Somebody said, show up, shut up, and bring food. But cater to the needs of those communities who are being impacted and who are going to be part of that solution. Begin partnerships well in advance of a need. This is a big mistake that we see over and over again between academic and community partnerships. You need to engage early and often, and you can't disappear. I've worked with different community partners who have been burned right? By people who kind of come in, it's the kind of helicoptering in or parachuting in to save people and then not really sticking around to see that through. You need to co-create. So again, you need to be engaging early and often so that you can think about what are the questions that really need to be addressed. What are the intended outcomes, the methods, the dissemination? How are we going to work together to understand these challenges and to understand these solutions? I think back to probably 15 years ago when I did a project with some folks in public health, and we were working with one of our local communities in kind of a disadvantaged area. And we went in with a concern about brownfields and wanting to work with them on understanding how they perceive the risk from brownfields, what sorts of solutions, how can we work with them to address that. And when we started these conversations with that community, their response was, brownfields, but there's trash everywhere. And the trash is what's concerning us. So we promptly changed the entire project to focus on really what were their big questions and how could we better serve them in that way. So I think it's important to recognize that you can't come in with an agenda. You have to co-create that from the start. Include community members on the team for engagement. There are often great boundary spanners out there who are really comfortable working in this space between partnering institutions and communities. Recognize that the expertise is contextual. And this is why, again, that community level is so important. Because while we can share lessons and some lessons can be, replicated elsewhere, there is still that important context that has to be understood and worked within. You earn trust by giving trust. You should offer science as a resource and not a solution. I do some work in decision support and decision aiding, and we say the same sort of thing. Like, I can create a decision support tool, but it shouldn't make the decision for you, right? It's a resource to help you clarify what's important to you, what the science might say about the effectiveness of different solutions that are out there. But ultimately, it's just one of many resources towards understanding what the right solution might be. And this was something that when Carmen and I were chatting briefly before the event, I added this to the list: recognize what does not count as engagement. So we were kind of talking about where the kind of standard form of engagement that exists often in the federal government, and some of it is by statute, or public comment periods. In the world that I work in the human sciences, we call that the DAD method, which is decide, announce, defend, which is essentially, we've already made this decision, but now we're going to announce it and invite your feedback and then defend what we already decided against what you had to say. Worst kind of public engagement, not actually public engagement, and sadly is still sometimes the default way that we think about this, and especially in the governmental sector. We can do a lot better than that. So kind of going back, I guess, from the aside of thinking about community engagement and partnerships, but what works well to engage and mobilize? Design interventions that are grounded in theory and practice. So again, as a behavioral scientist, I can really pull on that literature and say, we know a lot about how to motivate people, how to engage people, how to communicate effectively. It's an art and a science, but there's definitely a science, and we need to be pulling on that. In my world of behavior and communication, we know that narratives and stories are one of the best ways to engage people and promote change. We know that it's good to promote psychological flexibility and mindfulness amongst people, especially when you're dealing with these sorts of what can be overwhelming challenges. We know that hope is a better way to motivate positive change than fear. We've made the mistake of scaring people a little too much about climate challenges, whereas we should be focusing on instilling hope through the sort of positive stories that are out there and the solutions we have available. We need to focus on shared goals and values. This is how you build trust. Interpersonal trust is based on shared values, goals, and motivations. And so we have to figure out what those kind of values and goals are that we share, and work together around those pieces of common ground. And again, I could go on and on and on, but just in the communication space, just to give 2 examples, these are a couple resources that I have found really helpful that I use in my classes. This guide to effective climate change communication is getting a little older now, but still just a great distillation of a lot of what we know from the communication world and communication science, and how it can be applied to engaging people around climate change. This is another kind of nice, simple graphic. It was a partnership between the Center for Science Communication Research at the University of Oregon and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. But it's like, here's your 10 research-backed tips for climate communication, right? These resources are out there. You could find similar sort of tips for doing public engagement, right? You could find similar sort of tips for promoting behavior change. And these are the sorts of things that we can be using more effectively. I already talked about this a little bit, but we need to shift from a focus on coping to transformation, and this could require different knowledge and different types of science. And so on one hand, I would argue the human sciences might be the other type of science that we need to really get the shift from coping to transformation. But it also requires different ways of knowing, right? And so I see we have some speakers today that will be talking about this, but our Indigenous communities are not only on the front lines of climate change, but also have ways of knowing and knowledge to bring to this that may overlap or may not with some forms of Western science, but we are not leveraging that depth of knowledge, and we are not working with those partners in ways that really brings that to the forefront as a way to think about dealing with these challenges. So we really need to question if we're relying too much on our kind of traditional Western science models to deal with this fairly unprecedented challenge when we have communities and individuals thinking about this and passing on knowledge over much longer timescales. That might be much more appropriate to asking these questions. So what are the next steps? I think I have about 5 minutes left, so hopefully I'm wrapping up with time for some questions. Next steps, I like to talk about the coalition of the willing. So this is a phrase that I borrowed from a mentor of mine here at Ohio State. And in the work that I do with her through our Sustainability Institute, we often talk about identifying the coalition of the willing, and it's recognizing that not everyone and every sector who's working on these challenges really wants to do this hard work. Not every physical scientist that I know wants to do interdisciplinary science and include behavioral heterogeneity in their models, right? They don't all want to do that. Some of them do. Not all social scientists want to do this interdisciplinary work, right? Not all individuals working in the governmental sector, whether it be the EPA or elsewhere, necessarily want to do this work, but there are people who are willing and people who want to and might even have a knack for it. And so we have to figure out who those people are, and we take that coalition of the willing and we do better. So we should be doing actionable team science. We should be engaging in explicit translation of our findings to make sure that those lessons are being passed on and shared. We need to accompany the communities that are impacted by climate, and we have to co-create with them. And I like to use this analogy, which kind of comes from research on efficacy and kind of making people feel like they have the ability to take action. You know, if you have a day, just get a little more knowledgeable, right? Read that paper I shared about community engagement and how to do that better. Find an overview of what the social sciences can bring to understanding climate science, right? Take a little bit of time to understand that. If you have a month, right, perhaps try to understand some of the communities that are impacted in the work that you do and who you should get to know and who you should be having conversations with, right? And if you have a year, meaning you've got lots of time and energy to devote to this and it's something you're really excited about, then go do it, right? Go out and actually do the hard work. Embrace multiple types of knowledge and expertise, know your place. We've already mentioned about what these other types of knowledge and expertise might be. Everyone has a place, but know your place and know when to step back and let other voices be heard. We need to do more synthetic and cumulative work to identify what actually works in different contexts. A lot of science and science broadly, this is a critique of the human and the natural and technological sciences, but fails to do this, fails to kind of think across these scales and to figure out these context-specific effects. We need to understand the dynamics between the scales at which we work. So when we talk about human sciences, it might be thinking about individuals versus communities versus polities and dynamics between those. For all of us, it might be across time and space, right? Against these scales that we're not always paying as much attention to. I like this graphic as a way to think about scales in the human sciences. Like, I'm someone who studies the individual down here, but that individual is embedded in social networks, organizations, schools, workplaces, communities that provide different amounts of access and connectedness and space and embedded in these political boundaries as well, right? So we have to think about how action is influenced by factors across all of these scales. We have to consider the level of organization within the hierarchy where change actually occurs. And so again, our workshop focused a lot on this kind of community scale as being a place where perhaps we can make the most progress. We have to consider these spatial and temporal dynamics of action today relative to the past and the future. And we also talked about scaling up a lot in our workshop, and this is just considering how we can replicate the success stories for greater effect. Bringing those success stories to scale or scaling them up, or like Eleanor Ostrom would say, take those successes and just replicate them at that same scale all over the place. We need to do a better job of that. Conduct open science, share data, make it more accessible, and better summarize and make accessible what we know works. So these are some of the things that I think we can all be doing if we're excited about doing a little better in the space. And then I'll end with this quick set of kind of long-term next steps for our system. So if you're someone who has the ability to shift cultures and incentives in academia or in science, great, do it. A lot of the work that I want to do around behavior change requires really long time scales to measure the effectiveness of different interventions on behavior change, and no one wants to fund that. And also it doesn't work well with a tenure clock. So we really need to be thinking about shifting these cultures and these incentives so that we can do the work that's necessary for these big global challenges. We need greater representativeness in our research community, so we're not as disconnected from some of the communities that we might be working in or working for. We need to educate our workforce differently. I often get asked, can you come and teach every medical doctor in our program about risk communication? Nope, no, I can't, not in 30 to 45 minutes. Like, you might need to be trained differently. So we need to be thinking about what are we not training our experts to know and do. We need to increase funding, I mentioned this, for more of this long-term community engaged and interdisciplinary work. Adjust our funding systems that, again, don't always embrace what it takes to do this type of work. And then build policy mechanisms, right? A lot of this was focused on our workshop. It was kind of partnerships between, institutions of change and communities, but policy mechanisms that would empower individual and community transformation while avoiding some of the more maladaptive responses that we might tend towards are also necessary. So I will end with that. I hope we have plenty of time for questions, but thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I took lots of notes, and hopefully the others in the room did too. There were a lot of lessons to be learned from your talk. I wanted to acknowledge that we have a member of the National Academies, or a member or someone involved with the National Academies workshop that Robyn just talked about. Ariane Teherani is here with us from UC San Francisco. Ariane is the founding co-director of the UC Center for Climate Health and Equity as well. And so we have about...
Ariane had emailed me and I said, oh good, you're in the room, you can answer questions too. So if you have questions after, ask Ariane.
Sounds like a plan. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the room and from Zoom. I was told by our AV folks that they specifically set up a standing mic in the corner of the room so that whoever's asking the question actually will appear on camera. So if you have any questions, please approach the microphone. If we don't have questions in the room, or while you're thinking, do we have any on Zoom? Go ahead.
Check.
I can hear you.
Dr. Wilson, fascinating presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. I guess my question is, your approach seems to be conceive of scaling up environmental activism as kind of a collective action problem. Like everyone's out there and we're all on board and it's just a matter of finding ways to motivate people and coordinate action. And I'm just wondering, I'm seeing like a lot of structural obstacles and active resistance, right? Like capture of policy-making spaces by carbon fuel companies, an anti-majoritarian political system, right, that prevents preferences from being translated into policy, and then active resistance in public opinion that's cultivated by a media ecosystem and political entrepreneurs that make climate denial like a badge of identity, right? So I guess my question is, how does that fit into your perspective and what you're advocating? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll attempt to add some thoughts to that. So I think the one thing I mentioned is that even action at a community level, if you can solve the coordination problem, if you can get a group of people to want to figure out how to solve problems locally, you still need that individual buy-in, and you still do need that top-down structural support, right? So those challenges are still there. It's not that we can just pretend those don't exist. I do think sometimes there's like kind of two more thoughts I had in that. I think that sometimes we forget that what might seem like really vocal opposition is not as strong as you think. So the latest data from the Yale Climate Communication Project, I think, shows that only 9% of the US public are climate deniers. So sadly, we often hear from the loudest minorities, right, on either end of the spectrum when we're talking about a particular problem. So I think sometimes what we might see as opposition is not really opposition. It's just that we have a lot of quiet people in the middle who are looking for a reason to get involved. And that's who we want to be focusing on. And it kind of goes back a little bit to my coalition of the willing comment, but within a community context, right? When we are trying to engage people, and so this is, again, just from a behavioral science standpoint or communication standpoint, our target is always the people in the middle, right? I just gave a climate talk the other day for a Science Sundays event in Columbus. And we talked about how, like, when you are trying to convince people to get involved in these actions, you are not trying to convince the 9% that are deniers, and you're also not trying to convince the 25% who are alarmed, right? They're pretty stuck where they are, and then depending on your goals, one's in a good space and one's not, right? You're focusing on those people in the middle who are either somewhat concerned or somewhat cautious and need to be convinced and need to have a good reason to get engaged. And that's where we talk about, like, what are those values at risk? What is it that is actually meaningful? And maybe the way we're talking about it is not the right way to engage some of the communities or some of the people that we want to work with. So I think it's that. And then I think the third thing, as you were talking, was just like, this is the importance of team science, right? I can stand there as a behavioral scientist go, oh gosh, I'm not an environmental justice researcher, I'm not a political scientist, and I don't understand, coordination networks in the political space, right? But I have to work with people like that in order for us to complete this holistic picture of how we solve these challenges. So I think your point, almost more than anything else, maybe reiterates the importance of having that diverse expertise at the table to talk about how to address all of those challenges that exist.
Thank you. Are there any other questions online? Questions from the room? Okay, with that, Robyn, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing information that maybe many of us are still trying to digest and figure out. And yeah, that's it.
All right, thanks.
Dr. Wilson, thank you.